Welcome back to Shrinking It Down. I'm Gene Beresin.
And I'm Steve Schlozman, and today we have
Ellen Braaten.
Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me again.
So, in the wake of the tragic Parkland High School shooting, we've seen this incredible upsurge in teenage activism. And, everyone's talking about it, but few people actually talk about it the way I hope that we'll talk about it today. And that is activism a good thing for teenagers developmentally? And regardless of what they're being, regardless of what they're doing, is it a
Stop. We're not going to solve that problem. Let me just be clear about that. Like, this is not like a binary thing where we're going to say, yes, it is good, or no, it is not.
Right.
We're going to make this complex, right?
Right. Well, and I would say from the beginning, it's part of adolescence, regardless of whether we put a judgment on it. Part of being an adolescent is sort of like pushing the boundaries. And that's sort of what activism is.
Yeah, so activism is one step from acting out, right?
Exactly,
Yeah.
and this is what teens do.
So one component of that, you're talking about pushing the limits, rebelliousness.
Exactly, like being
testing.
an activist. It's sort of like, who am I? Who are my, where are my people? What are the things I believe in? These are all the things that teens normally
you know what?
do.
And I've had a bunch of kids, including my own, say, this activism is no fun because they've given us permission to walk out.
Oh, that's interesting.
She was like, what is the big deal? The principal says, you all now have permission to walk out for your walkout. And she said, if he gives us permission, it's not a walkout. The only thing that makes it a walkout is there being consequences for the walkout.
So defying authority.
Yeah. I mean,
is part of like testing the limits of being a teenager.
So what we're kind of arguing here, I guess, is, the activism, it's great to hear what kids believe and think. There is this thing which we'll get to downstream, which is whether it's putting
cognitive.
kind of undue burdens on their shoulders and not giving them a chance to be kids. But we also have to remember that it lends itself particularly well to the developmental state of just being a teenager.
Okay, so what are the developmental, so teenagers have issues, developmentally, they're struggling with identity, they're struggling with being a part of a group and being individuals at the same time.
And just to be clear, struggling isn't bad. You don't mean that in a
No,
negative
I mean,
way.
that's
it's just
what
the thing they're working on.
That's what they're working on.
Right.
It's normal. So just to lay them out, identity, group inclusion versus being your own person, testing the limits, which we've talked about, and being rebellious. How about creative expression, because that's a part of it as well. And the last one, which I think is really interesting and important, is their newfound abilities to kind of look at things in a more complex way. They're cognitive development. So they're beginning to focus on abstract things like justice and, what's good and what's...
No, it's why they read the Odyssey in 11th grade or 9th grade instead of 5th grade. The
Something
words
they
aren't any
couldn't do in
harder.
5th grade.
No, they could read the words, it just wouldn't make sense.
They wouldn't get it.
I'd also add to that list social connectedness too. It's a very social time of life, the time when we're trying to figure out social relationships, which again, I think is part of this activism too. Part of the positive things that I'm hearing from kids about this.
But that brings us, I guess, kind of to a negative side, which is that if you are an activist for a particular cause, you necessarily separate yourself from the folks who are not an activist for that particular cause. And then and this is nothing that hasn't happened for eons for teenagers, by definition, someone gets left out. Right? This is all about being part of the group. And if 96% of your school believes in this walkout and does it, but 4% don't, how comfortable are those 4%? They become the true activists at that point, not the 96. It's the 4. So these are the kinds of burdens that come with being an activist, and this is, I guess, where some of my concerns are with this upsurge. I'm all for it in theory, but I have concerns.
Right, because so let's say we talk about the positive side of it, which is like, who am I? Identity.
Right.
And teenagers are developmentally struggling and challenging themselves with who they are and who they're not, and like what makes me who I am. But then what you're pointing out, Steve, is that if 80% or 60% are, enough is enough. They're marching, they're like part of the movement. What about those other kids? Who are they? I mean, are they marginalized? And then what's their identity? And how can they assert their identity when it's really not a cool thing? And many high school campuses, what I've heard from a lot of kids is, if you're not a part of the activism, if you don't even agree with the activism, because...
Or if you just want to question it. I mean, it doesn't even have to be not agreeing. It could just be like, can we stop and think about this for a second?
Can we even talk about it?
And this is the irony. Right. I mean, you've talked a lot about this. The main goal of being a teenager in high school is to learn to think more complexly.
Right.
And yet, when you say, "Hey, we're all behind this,"
Right.
you just bypass that.
Exactly.
You cut off conversation.
Right, you do. And you also are in this forced choice then that perhaps is an identity that you sort of are kind of stuck with for a while and aren't allowed to play with, which is kind of what you're saying, is that you're in a forced category in some ways.
Yep.
And the discussion stops.
And to be fair, we've given this to them, right? Like
Yes, I think
the
this is an
prevailing
important-
culture
yes.
has mapped these forced identities through things like
Yes.
social media and the sort of very binary way that the world tends
Which
to be
side
looked
are you
at.
on?
Right.
Right,
You're not asking
right.
that. You're saying that as an
Yeah.
example.
That's an example,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And you know, one of the examples that I see in my work, particularly with college kids, for example, is that college young adults, they don't like being called kids. Okay. In some campuses, if you are not liberal, if you, for example, are a conservative in this day and age, you are excluded, you're isolated, you have no place to express yourself, you're actually rejected. You know, and you would think, you know, I say to them, look, isn't this a time where you actually want to sit down and actually talk with each other, debate the issues?
But the way you just described it is, I don't mean this as an insult, but it's a setup for the problem that's been created. You said if you're not liberal or conservative, and those categories by themselves become limiting, right? So
and that's
Yes,
what I'm seeing, right? And now you're saying that that's what we're imposing on the
I think
kids?
we've done it.
The adults have.
We just did it
Well,
just
look-
now,
well,
just in here.
But maybe we're mirroring what's happening in our country.
Of course, yeah, that's what we do.
Yeah.
Because we're human and we belong to the tribe. You know, so we're
And right
tribal
now we're probably
creatures.
more polarized than I can ever remember.
Not a newsflash. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
then,
So we've put this burden on
Right.
the kids.
so what do we do?
So is it our job to help correct that? I mean, that gets into the role of that they're still teenagers, and even college students who are young adults, they're not mature yet. You know, are we leaving them alone?
I want to hear what Dr. Braaten has
So
to say.
I think this is a good question, because a lot of the people who've been critical of some of the marches have said that it's really something that's been created by adults. And on the one side of the fence, people are saying these kids are being used. On the other side of the fence, people are saying this is a breath of fresh air. This is just what we need, and we shouldn't not allow kids to express themselves, which I'm all in for.
Yeah.
I'm all in favor of kids expressing themselves. But I think that I think that in order for kids to get the kind of platforms that they've had, a lot of adults have to be in on it.
Right.
And you know, these what we're talking, the kinds of marches that we've seen, and I think this is why people are having a reaction to it in some ways, is that it's orchestrated. These are not. It's not just 15-year-olds walking out of their classrooms with hand-painted signs. There's TV coverage.
This ain't a
and
Breakfast Club
it's-
moment. This is not
yes,
the fist in
it's
the air.
it's
This
it's
is,
not.
Right.
That doesn't mean that's bad either, but it's a little different than people just rioting on their own. It's like there's TV coverage, there's interviews before time. They're sitting in green rooms and
So
have
and the rapidity, or not the rapidity,
The-
the
the
rapidness
quickness,
with
yes.
which
With quickness.
somebody went from a march to suddenly being on CNN.
yes,
is
or
like-
before they're even at the march,
Right.
being on CNN, and then also being thought of as kind of like the experts that we go to figure out what to do. And I think that's the difference.
And that's a
that's
burden.
where that's
yeah,
a
because
burden.
I was just watching the news the other night, and there were 3 students, and the commentator was saying, like, well, you know, help me understand this. Help me understand what the real issues are. You know, we're learning so much from you. And I was thinking, like, geez, that's putting a huge burden on these teenagers who do have really good ideas and opinions. But to add to that,
But
you're teaching me, the commentator, about, I mean, so like, what are they, what kind of a burden is that?
It's a huge burden, and then the problem is that in the pushing back, you get these, and I'm happy to say this here, you get these ridiculous comments like we heard from former Congressperson Santorum,
Yeah.
right, where he
Oh,
said, like, they ought to just
yes.
learn CPR,
Yes.
which I think he was responding to some of what we're saying,
Right.
but the
Yeah.
response was to totally disable.
right.
Well, and to
right.
make it even worse, there was the Fox commentator that actually publicly dissed and
Oh, what schools he didn't get into. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, but so that's what it's fair game for politicians, for adults to kind of like knock each other out.
It was a great moment of kids acting like adults, and
then the adults smash. But
Yes.
but look at the risks. I mean, back in the old days when we demonstrated, you didn't have you had the risk of being excluded or chewed out locally, like in a small room or wherever. But now, if you've been knocked down by the commentator on Fox News, millions and millions of people around the world are going to actually see you being assaulted.
So I'm going to ask Ellen something. Let's say you're consulting to a school. Let's say a school's called you up and they said, we got this issue. These kids want to do a march, and they actually want their voice to be heard, and we want that voice to be heard, but we also want to keep in mind the very things we're talking about.
Right.
What's your advice?
Well, the first thing I'd want to do is talk with the kids and not the administrators. Like that would be the first thing I would do. Yeah. And then I think I would listen to them. I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all for every single school. I think it's very different from when this has happened in your school, and I think this is where this gets complicated, is a lot of people some people are feeling protective of the kids who had an enormous trauma forced upon them. I think that's different than talking about just a school in the middle of Massachusetts who would like to commemorate something. I think that the answer to that question is going to depend on the student population and their experiences. And I think something that you were saying too is I think we've gotten away, when we have kids on CNN being asked, what do we do now? What we've done is forgotten their story. And I think that's one thing that we haven't heard enough of is their personal stories.
Yes.
We've made this jump into thinking about, well, what do we do? And you're so
You are now a
wonderful.
policy advisor.
You're now the policy advisor as opposed to, and I actually, in thinking back on this, I don't think we have heard enough stories over the last 2 decades that this has been going on. I think this happens. It's so horrific to even think about that we haven't really heard that much of what was this like. That actually may change policy and perspectives faster.
In fact, this is worth saying,
The stories
and we
will.
could actually tell this to schools if they come to us, and they are coming to us. Yeah. There's really good data that the thing that changes policies are narratives. It's not a protest.
And we have not heard narratives.
No.
Not in the last 2 decades since Columbine, and really not now. We're hearing,
Some of the marches, like we're all focused on the gun stuff, but there will be future marches. I happen to have gone to the gun march in a very red state because I was visiting my folks. It was very moderate, and there were narratives. The teachers and students got up there and told stories. That I found more moving, and I think that crowd reacted better to that too. This was not this was a crowd where people actually were actively carrying weapons at the gun march. They weren't anti-gun, they were just, we had to be more reasonable about it. And they responded to the narrative, to the story.
Yeah.
Right.
So I guess I'm just piling on to what you said. I agree.
Yeah.
No, that's true.
Yeah.
Well, it's time in the show for monumental mental health myths. And here's one that I will give you.
Okay. Thank you.
For us.
Okay. Well, who else would it be?
He can answer it
for the
himself.
school.
For Herman over here.
Okay. Marches, not like the month of March, but the marches that we've been talking about, are the only way to express opinions that are available to kids. That's all they got.
Well, this is an easy one. Of
Go
course
ahead.
not. I mean, there are many ways of kids expressing themselves, and some are part of their educational curriculum.
Yep.
I mean, part of taking history and social studies and English is as a way of kind of looking at what other people have said and finding your own voice.
Yep.
And that is...
My town had local elections yesterday, and my 12-year-old came home and said, I need you to vote in that because it's the school committee and it has something to do with what my education will be.
Yeah.
And I said, who do you want me to vote for? She said, that's your job. I want you to read that stuff.
That's great.
And it was a really sweet moment.
Yes.
She said, I'm counting on you to help me have my voice be heard.
Oh, that's great.
Oh, that is great.
So, I mean, she
Then
didn't say
did you
that
talk
well.
with her after you voted about
I
to
told
have a
her-
conversation with her
Yeah,
about your
Yeah, but she didn't want to
decision
know.
making?
She said, I trust your decision. You're my dad. I'm going to go with it. But I'm glad you voted. So
That's nice.
I mean, those are one of the ways kids
It
can
is.
get
And
their
I think
voice
when we were
forward.
talking before about what might be missing, I think that might be the piece that's missing, or we don't hear we've put kids in this box that they have to find the answers again, as opposed to them saying, here's what's been happening for me. Now you better go fix this. And as the adult.
Right. So the goal, just to wrap this one up, the goal need not be to be on CNN, which is what a march might yield. The goal is to get your voice heard.
Exactly.
And it may be that by being on CNN, your voice ironically stops being heard because the stories get lost.
That is quite possible.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that occurred to me, which was a really incredible answer that I didn't expect. So one of these kids was being interviewed and or having a conversation about why teachers should or should not have guns, and the kid happened to be African American, and it just naturally came up. You know, like as a black kid, I'm not sure that I trust a teacher to have a gun because I could be a target. And I thought like, whoa, okay. Because, and then the kid told a story about one of the shootings that had been, that she had heard and seen in the news, and worried that this could happen to me if a teacher has a gun, and just kind of reflexively kind of like treats me like the others that I've seen. And it just came up so naturally and spontaneously. It wasn't scripted, it was just a conversation. So it was kind of part of the storyline that this kid was experiencing. I don't think that the kid would have expressed that if there wasn't an open-ended conversation. It was clearly not scripted. You give that one to me.
I just can't reach it, so I need your help. Thank you. Now I'll give it to you. There.
Thanks. This one is for you.
Both of us.
Every kid in America agrees with the kids who are marching.
Another softball.
Yeah, we kind of went. I mean, we've been here.
We've been there. We've done that.
Yeah, yeah. What do you think? How would you? 5 words.
No,
That's
no,
one.
no.
Well,
Two. Make
Definitely
you're gonna
not.
tweet it.
And no.
Right. 30 characters
Hashtag.
or less.
Less than 280 characters.
Not
disagree.
true.
That's right.
Hashtag
Right.
disagree.
Yeah, no, kids, and I guess the thing to remember is that kids have a multitude of opinions that don't lend themselves to easy categorization. Wait a minute, I'm not done.
Okay.
And
Oh, you're never going to fit this on a tweet, but keep going.
they neither lend themselves
Right.
to easy
It's not
categorization,
140.
nor do they have any kind of reliability. They're allowed to change their opinions, and just by the nature of the teenage brain, the adolescent brain, they're likely to change their opinion more often than our adults.
Are they pressured to agree in ways which is not healthy for them?
Well, they're definitely pressured to agree. That's nothing new. It's never healthy to be pressured if it's undue pressure, but it is part of being human to have people to try to convince you of their point of view.
Yeah, but teens are, I think one of you mentioned this before, pressure in teens, usually it doesn't work that well unless it's peer pressure. When it's adult pressure, and you're talking about peer pressure, but when this is coming from sort of the adult climate, I think then we run the risk of them coming up with some other sort of opinion that might even be something we'd never thought of
Well,
before.
just as you were pointing out about their needing to have a voice and tell their stories, what I haven't seen enough of, besides individual stories and narratives, is these kids talking together with each other on their own. You know, without feeling the pressure of an adult in the room, or feeling scripted, or giving a talk, or giving a speech, which they're reading. I would just love to watch them and hear them having conversations with each other, you know, and batting things around, and having the opportunities to do those kinds of things.
Yeah.
Well, thanks a lot for listening and watching. And if you have any comments or input or questions or things that you'd like to see about this or anything else, just let us know. I'm Gene Beresin.
I'm Steve Schlozman.
And I'm Ellen Braaten.
Thanks.
See you next time.